So welcome everyone to Demystifying the Living Wage in a High Inflation Environment. My name is Biko Nagara. I'm with Living Wage for Us. Michelle Murray, our CEO, is also here on the line with us, as well as Zane and Elise from the Economic Policy Institute. Thanks so much, Zane and Elise, for joining us today, and everyone on the line for tuning in. So we're going to go ahead and jump in and get started here. Just a really quick introduction for most of you on the line. Already know us, but as you know, Living Wage for Us, we are a living wage certification organization. We're developing a community of living wage paying and living wage aspiring employers. We have a two-tier living wage seal, and what we do is we support to design and implement living wage strategies. So we support employers to design and implement living wage strategies within their organizations. We work with all sizes of organizations, from small local businesses to national, multinational companies. We provide a simplified verification process with grievance mechanisms that reduce the complexity and the cost and time associated with getting certified. And we provide effective communications about the impacts, and we celebrate our living wage employers. We're really excited now as we go into our second year of our program with the partners that we've already certified and already announced on our website. We have quite a few more employers that are in the pipeline that are moving forward, and we're going to be announcing very soon later this year. And so also additionally, our work is guided by multi-stakeholder engagement. And we use a rigorous and transparent set of calculations and living wage standard that is achievable and ambitious yet achievable. And so really what we're going to be talking about today is the living wage methodology, the living wage calculations, what's changed since last year. And so in this, we really wanted to bring on our colleagues from Economic Policy Institute to really help us talk about what's behind the calculation, what's behind the secret sauce of the data that we put out there that is really the basic building blocks of our entire program. And so I'm going to hand it over to Zane and Elise to talk about EPI and the cost of living calculator, and then we'll come back and we'll talk about some of the specifics around the living wage rates, where we are this year, and then what it means for you as a living wage employer if you're part of our system or aspiring to become part of our system.
Hi, I'm Elise Gould. I'm a senior economist at the Economic Policy Institute. EPI is a nonprofit, nonpartisan think tank. We're in Washington, D.C. And a lot of the research that we do has to do with wages and employment and living standards for working people in this country. And we have been putting out our family budget calculator for over 20 years now. It is a way that we calculate a modest standard of living, and by no means it's middle class. We have no savings. It's not particularly secure, but it is for individuals or families that are living paycheck to paycheck, what it requires to make ends meet. So in terms of their housing and rent and childcare and healthcare and transportation and other necessities and their taxes, what that takes. And our family budget calculator, as I said, has been around for more than 20 years. It's used by researchers, policymakers, advocates, obviously businesses as well, to help set affordable wages. I'm going to turn it over to Zane, who's going to talk us through some of the different elements of our calculator and what has changed and what we expect to change in the coming periods.
Awesome. So I'm Zane Mokhyber, everyone. I'm a data analyst here at EPI. Yep. Okay, so yeah, like Elise said, the EPI family budget calculator is a basic family budget for every metro area and county in the United States. And again, it measures the income needed for sort of what we call a modest but adequate standard of living in the United States. It includes 7 budget categories for 10 family types. So housing, food, childcare, transportation, healthcare, other necessities, and taxes. And the family types are from 1 adult and 0 children to 2 adults and 4 children, and all the different combinations in between. So I'm going to do a quick overview or a quick demonstration of the EPI family budget calculator, and then I'll get into the methodology and some of the trends that we're seeing with each budget category. So this is what the EPI family budget calculator looks like. You have the option to type in city or county. So I'm going to type in Washington, DC. And I'll select the DC metro area. So that's all of the counties surrounding DC as well as the district. And the default option here is 2 adults and 2 children. I'll leave it on that, but you could change it if you wanted to. And you can see here, it gives you the costs for each budget type in for the monthly costs and for the annual costs. And then you could add a comparison here if you wanted to. So I could add another city like Miami. And you can compare those 2 cities directly. And then if you scroll down here a little bit, you'll see some other resources as well. So we have the family budget map and the family budget fact sheets. So I have the map open over here. And if you look at the map, you can see the various budgets by county for the total budget overall, or I can click on a specific budget like transportation, for example. And that would map out the costs there. And then we also have the family budget fact sheet, which shows all of the same information, just in kind of like a 1-page printable version with a couple of charts. And then if you go back to the main page and scroll all the way to the bottom here, you can check out the technical documentation methodology for the family budget calculator, which is what I'm about to go into now. So data for the housing budget in the family budget calculator. Well, before I get into the housing, let me say, generally speaking, at EPI, we try to use the best sources of data possible for all of these budget categories. So typically that means a government survey or some government source for each data, for each budget category. In some cases, we have to use data that other organizations have collected. And it'll be clear what those are once we get to those categories. So I'll start with housing. Data for our housing budget comes from the U.S. Department of Housing and Urban Development. And we use their published fair market rents, which they publish every year. Fair market rents inform certain federal housing assistance programs. For example, landlord reimbursements for rental housing vouchers. And FMRs are based on data from the American Community Survey, which comes from the census. For our housing budgets, EPI uses the 40th percentile rent in a given area, as opposed to the median or average rent in a given area. And again, that's in line with our sort of more conservative, modest, yet adequate standard for the family budget calculator. The general trend we've seen from the prior version of the family budget calculator to this update is we saw about a 3.5% increase in the housing costs. Moving on to food, we base our food costs on the USDA national food cost plans. They publish a couple of different cost points, and we use their low cost plan. So this gives us a national number for food. And these are published by age group as well. So we adjust the food costs to family types based on the various age groups. But this doesn't give us county level variation. So this is where we bring in some data from the organization called Feeding America. Every year they produce a report called Map the Meal Gap. And in that report, they produce an index which calculates county level costs relative to the national average cost for food. So we apply those relative differences to the USDA number to get family level data and county level data for the for food costs. The trend, food has only gone up about a percentage point in this recent update of the calculator. But as we all know, food costs have increased pretty substantially over the last year or so. And so that will most likely be reflected in the next update calculator, next year's update. Moving on to healthcare, our healthcare budgets are healthcare premiums plus out-of-pocket costs for families. Premium costs come from the Kaiser Family Foundation's health insurance marketplace calculator. And out-of-pocket costs come from the Department of Health and Human Services Medical Expenditure Panel Survey. For the premium costs, these are entirely based on the ACA health marketplace exchanges. So there's no employer provided health insurance included in our calculations. It's entirely individual. And for the MEPS out-of-pocket cost data, that's entirely private insurance as well. The trend we've seen here is that premiums have increased for children, so we don't see much of a change in the individual healthcare costs from last year's update to this year's update, but families with children did see about a 5% increase. All right, moving on to childcare. The childcare is an area where we've changed the methodology slightly from last year's update to this year's update. The childcare budgets are still based on a market rate survey that's conducted by an organization called Childcare Aware of America. And they produce a report every year that gets average costs for center-based care and home-based or family-based care by state. So that's where we get the data for geographic location. And then also depending on where a given area is, we either use family-based care costs or center-based care costs. And for a given makeup of the family, we'll use either infant care or 4-year-old care or school-based care to differentiate those costs and get it as accurate as possible. The methodological change we've made this year, the current version of the calculator, we averaged together several years of data from these reports. And this is primarily because we've seen volatility year to year in their data sets. So we wanted to try to smooth that out a little bit and create more accurate estimates across all of the states and all of the family types. So the trend we've seen in with childcare data, even though there's been a methodological change, we see about a 5% increase overall in childcare costs. I would like to mention here that we are considering changing the methodology around childcare again in next year's update. And this is because there's a new data set available from the Department of Labor that was released earlier this year. And so hopefully that once again will improve the accuracy of our estimates going forward into the future. Okay, so moving on to the last three budget categories in the EPI family budget calculator. For transportation costs, we worked with an organization called the Center for Neighborhood Technology. They have a resource called the Housing Plus Transportation Index, which models transportation costs by county and family type based on auto ownership, auto use, and transit use. And we had them modify their model slightly to work with our needs, but it's basically based entirely on their methodology. And another update in transportation will be coming later this year. They recently updated their model and published a new index. So that will be included in next year's family budget calculator as well. What we've seen in trends around transportation is from last year's update to this year's update is about a 7.5% increase in transportation costs. And we sort of expect that to continue over the following update, as transportation costs over the past 2 or 3 years have increased pretty substantially, at least over the time period that we're looking at here. Okay, moving on to other necessities. Other necessities are derived straight from the Bureau of Labor Statistics Consumer Expenditure Survey, where they ask about household spending. And so we include data on apparel, personal care, household supplies, reading materials, and school supplies in our other necessities calculation. And once again, here I'd like to reiterate the CEX includes a lot of categories, but we try to keep it as simple as possible. For example, in addition to the family budget calculator prior to the 2018 update, we included entertainment and other miscellaneous items in our calculations, but we decided to remove that in order to, more narrowly assess what's the bare minimum income required to get by. So these are truly necessities in our opinion. In terms of a trend in other necessities spending, we saw about a 5.5% increase there. And then finally, the last category, taxes, are modeled on the total budget cost, but obviously the total budget cost is a post-tax cost. So we need to come up with some way to estimate what someone's income would actually need to be to cover taxes plus the rest of the budgets. So we used a model from the National Bureau of Economic Research called TaxIM, which is a micro simulation model of US federal and state income taxes. And we basically take the post-tax number or the total budget and iterate around plausible pre-tax income numbers until a post-tax income number is a plausible post-tax income number is reached. Sorry, pre-tax income. So that's the basic methodology for all of the budget categories in the family budget calculator. And all of these are detailed in the methodology section I highlighted earlier. If you have, if you want to take a deep dive into the family budget calculator methodology. But wrapping up, I just want to put an emphasis on the fact that this is, we try to keep this a conservative, basic budget, and try to estimate the budgets at a reasonable level. For example, the 40th percentile rent instead of the median rent, or keeping other necessities to the minimum of what is needed. So yeah, I will pass it back to you, Biko, for the rest of the presentation. And
thanks so much, Zane. I'll just pause here and just say, if anyone does have any questions, feel free to put them either in the chat or the Q&A section. You should be able to click on those options at the bottom of your screen. So one of the questions that we get all the time from employers is, okay, so there's all this data out here, right? There's great work from organizations like EPI on the family budget calculator, but how do I take this and apply it in my business? What is that number? I need to know how I use, how do I use this information to achieve my living wage goals as an employer? So we really take the concept of living wage from the Global Living Wage Coalition. The definitions here on the screen, you might have seen this before, so I'm not going to read this, but just to explain that, we really follow the international norms around how we define and how we come up with that living wage calculation. Okay, and one of the key things here is that it is a family concept. So what this means is we have on the screen here a graphic that shows what are the components that make up that living wage calculation. And a lot of these are the ones that we take directly from the work that EPI has done. So housing costs, food costs, childcare, transportation, and then we take that data and then we do some additional post-production calculation on healthcare costs and other costs and unexpected events. And that gets us to the cost of a basic but decent life for a reference family. So I won't get into a lot of detail around how we calculate the reference family, but we do have an informational sheet on our website that we'll share the link with you for you in case you'd like to know more about the sources for how we come up with that. But basically the concept is we come up with a model family, right? And then based on that model family, which is 2 adults, 2 children, 1.75 workers per family, that gives us the cost of a basic but decent life for a reference family. And then we calculate payroll and income taxes and divide by number of workers per family. And I'll explain on the next slide kind of how we do that iteratively and how we build on that data that Zane just described to get to a really accurate number that for the gross living wage that an employer can use in their operations. Okay, so but first, before I explain that, the data that we have is very locally specific, right? So we don't try to calculate one number for all of the USA. We don't even try to calculate one number for an entire state because there's a lot of diversity within states and even down to the level of the counties. So because we're able to do these calculations at the county level, we basically what we do here, and these graphics are from that infographic sheet that I mentioned, which we'll link in the comments. Basically, what we do is we take county commuting zones, which are based on USDA data of where there are labor movement patterns between counties and group counties together. So we still have a very high level of granularity in the living wage rates that we publish and that we use for our certification system. There's over 600 commuting zones across the country that group together over 3,000 counties across the US. So very locally specific. And that allows us to take into account differences between urban and rural costs of living. As I mentioned, we have 1.75 workers per family. So that means 1 full-time worker and 1 part-time worker. And the family size is set at 2 adults and 2 children. And this allows then for an employer to have a living wage benchmark to use in your program where you don't need to be and you don't want to as an employer really to set different rates for different individuals right within your company. You're not going to want to set provide a salary based on, well, this person has a family, this person doesn't have a family. The concept is the wage should be able to should allow an employee to support themselves and to support a family based on this model family concept. And so again, all of this is the way that we do this is aligned with the international approach, the anchor methodology, which is part of the global living, which was developed by the Global Living Wage Coalition. So we follow those principles. So how do we get there? Right? Using the data from the EPI calculations. Well, the first thing that we do is we recalculate the health insurance, including the health insurance subsidies on the market. And we do that at the income level of a family that's earning the living wage, right? So we look at what is the cost of living for a family of 4. So we take that reference family that we mentioned. Again, if you go to the EPI website, you can look up different types of families. You can look up the cost of living for an individual or a couple with no children, etc. So we take the 2 adults, 2 children reference family, and then we using a similar approach as what Zane mentioned earlier. We use TaxSim to simulate the payroll and income taxes, and we also recalculate the healthcare costs based on the open market, the health insurance plans available on the open market, factoring in health insurance premiums. And then we run those calculations recursively so that we get to the actual gross income level that gets us to the taxes and the healthcare costs that then result in the net take-home pay that will still cover those basic necessities that Zane was referring to earlier. So we, again, for healthcare, we adjust those from the EPI figures using the same data sources so that government subsidies are available at a living wage and silver level plan costed in our model for a family of 2 adults and 2 children. So that's specifically how we do that. And then for the taxes, also an iterative assessment, including healthcare premiums to capture the influence of government subsidies for health insurance on the gross income. And I should also mention, we only include local taxes at the city and county level that are significant, i.e. that's greater than 2%. So it's very specific and very granular here. And what we've seen this year, we haven't made any changes to the reference family. So we're using the same model family as we did in the previous year's living wage estimates. But we did rerun these numbers based on the latest data. And one of the trends that we did notice is that although we saw an overall increase in the average of health insurance costs, we saw that increase by 23%. But at the same time, we saw a decrease in taxes of 3%. And so what's very interesting, and this is not equal across the board, across all geographies. In some geographies, we saw healthcare costs actually stay the same or decline. So there's quite a lot of geographic variation that we've seen in terms of those changes. And really interesting that, again, at the family level, we saw an overall decrease in the percentage of taxes, or I should say that 3% that I mentioned, a 3% decrease in overall taxes at the family level. This is not the case if we look at it at an individual level. So I'll come back to that in a second, but just to kind of preview that finding, because I do think it's quite interesting, is that what we did see that overall at the family level, a lot of the effects of inflation we've seen have been ameliorated by government policy, specifically in terms of tax policy and tax subsidies. So more on that in just a second. But before I get to that, the other post-production adjustments we make on the EPI calculations are on other costs. So for other necessities, we adjust those to include the full range of other expenses. So again, this is following the anchor methodology. We use a ratio from the Bureau of Labor Statistics Consumer Expenditure Survey for all costs not specifically designated in our estimate for food and housing, and we apply that to the local food and housing costs to assess the other necessities category. So that gives us comparable estimates for multinational organizations that are working on living wage, right? Because if you're using an anchor benchmark, say in another country that's been produced by the Global Living Wage Coalition, we use that same method for using that ratio from the Consumer Expenditure Survey. And then as we also add on a margin for unexpected events. This is also to align with global definitions. So that's a 5% margin that we add on that is intended to allow workers to cover unexpected costs. So for example, if your car breaks down, if you had an illness, funeral, weddings, etc. So these are some of the examples of things that you might need an extra margin to cover those kinds of short-term savings. And again, that helps with comparability with international benchmarks. But what we do here is because we've seen so much fluctuations across different geographies, and just as an example here on the graphic, I'm just looking at California and Nevada. We know there's been a lot of volatility in the economy during the pandemic, things like housing costs, and this graphic is just as an example showing the increase in and in some places actually a decrease in housing costs. So if you see where the highest causing increases were that we've seen in the data set, and then this is in the San Francisco Bay Area, we saw actually some decreases. So what we've done here is to avoid amplifying those fluctuations. We've smoothed out those fluctuations, not on the housing side, but in terms of other costs and unexpected events. So as other costs fluctuate, we've smoothed over the overall increase year over year from the other costs and the unexpected events. So that will help with some of those. If for example, we've seen that decrease in terms of housing in the Bay Area, we expect it's likely that will come up in the next year, right? So we don't want to amplify that volatility. We've smoothed that over in terms of the other costs and the unexpected events. Okay, so that gets us to probably the headline we all want to know. Okay, so what's the result, right? Where did we land this year in terms of the living wage rates? How did they change relative to last year? Well, I'm going to show two slides here that visualize the tier 1 and tier 2 rates. So if you're familiar with our system, you probably know the tier 1 is an entry level. It's not the living wage, right? The living wage is the family concept, but the tier 1 is an entry level that's set above the minimum wage, but it's also indexed to the individual cost of living. It's not equal to, but in higher cost areas, the tier 1 rate is 18. In the lowest cost areas, it's 15, and then there are areas in between those. So as you can see from this map, the lowest cost areas are going to be starting at $15 an hour as the tier 1 entry level for certification. And the highest cost of living areas are the green colored $18 an hour. And what's really striking here, actually it'd be interesting if I had an animation here, I'd like to show the change from last year to this year. But when we launched the program a little over a year ago, much more of the country was in this $15 an hour zone, and there were much less areas that were in this 18. So just in 1 year alone, in terms of looking at what the impact of inflation has been, we've seen that there has been a significant change where so much more of the country is in the $18 an hour zone, and there are very, very few places really left in the country where we're even indexing to a $15 an hour as an entry level. And as I mentioned, the tier 1, it's not equal to a living wage, it's not equal to an individual cost of living, but it is indexed to the individual cost of living. And what was really striking in the data that we saw is that in terms of the individual cost of living, we saw an 18% increase. So, we've seen obviously high inflation levels. Now the inflation numbers have started to come down a little bit, but we had, obviously very high levels of inflation 2022. And we're already seeing that 18% at an individual level. So, however, fortunately, the flip side of that, the good news is that when we look at the family the increase in cost of living at the family level, we're only seeing a 7% increase. Now, that's still a big increase, but what was really interesting is that a lot of the effects of inflation we're seeing have been ameliorated once we factor in the cost of living for a family, and a lot of that is driven by what I mentioned earlier in terms of tax policy, which is helping with in terms of a reduction on the tax savings side of things, and then also in not in all areas, but in some areas we saw also health insurance premiums, even though overall they increased. In some areas we saw health insurance premiums come down. And also, I should mention, as Zane mentioned earlier, some of that is affected by methodological changes. And so one of the most volatile costs of living are related to those childcare expenditures that were mentioned earlier. So through that methodological change that EPI is implementing this year, that is, we expect that will reduce year-over-year fluctuation, but it does mean that in some areas, for example, where last year when we launched the program, we might have seen a higher cost for childcare. This year, in some of those areas, we're going to see that cost is relatively less. But where we're seeing that, it is also based on averaging out over a number of years. So that's just one of the examples where we think that a methodological improvement is also going to improve our living wage estimates going forward. So if you're in a high, especially if you're in a high cost region like New York, for example, or Boston, are two that I can think of, you might see if you compare your previous living wage breakdown to this year, you might see some changes, like the cost of childcare will be relatively less in this year's calculation compared to last year's. What does it look like at the tier 2? This is the family living wage. This is ultimately, I think, probably the most interesting graphic that really tells a story of what's going on in terms of the living wage rates. So once we factored in all of those methodological and updates to the data, this is basically what the map looks like, with the highest cost being in purple. So as I mentioned, New York City, Boston are some of the highest cost areas of the country. Hawaii is also one of those, Denver, and then much of the Pacific Coast, especially from just north of Los Angeles up to the San Francisco Bay Area. Not surprising that those are some of the highest cost counties. And so in terms of what is that distribution, right? Similar to the tier 1 rates, we've seen significant increases, but as I mentioned earlier, much less, right, at the family level. And so at this point, this histogram, really what we're just trying to show with this is that this is the distribution of living wage rates. So on the left side here, these are what this is showing is how many of the commuting zones within our model have a living wage rate that ends up being under $17 an hour. As you can see, there's very few of those. And then there's some commuting zones here that are really in the much higher, higher living wage costs, which are over $30 an hour. And there are some of those, but really what I think is worth noting here is that the median falls somewhere here around $19, $20 an hour. So again, for a family living wage, I think that would be, the take home message here is that we're seeing if we look at it from a median perspective, and if we look at it from an average perspective, we've seen about a 7.4 increase in our living wage rates year over year. So that roughly tracks with overall inflation. And we're really looking at a country that's really shifting in terms of what that that overall, whether you're looking at the average or you're looking at the median, which is again falling around $19, $20 an hour. Okay, so I'm just going to pause there. So we're getting towards the end of the webinar and just ask if there are any questions. Michelle, is there anything that you'd like to add at this point?
Absolutely. So I think one of the things that I just wanted to frame here is that in our system, what we're talking about today is the actual calculation and rates and how we work off of EPI's great data to get to a living wage figure that we give you. But another piece that comes into play and that we have seen is that some of the costs that might have risen over the last year might be ameliorated by benefits currently provided by an employer. So the other part of what we do that's not included in this webinar is assess total remuneration inclusive of benefits against a living wage, where we can look at exactly what you're providing and how much that is giving in terms of savings. And what we have seen with some employers, interestingly enough, is that the health insurance plans they provided, they went ahead and absorbed a lot of the cost increases through that benefit that we're seeing in things like healthcare. So there is a possibility when we look at it both from the angle of the estimates themselves, but then how much is a specific employer, how is a specific employer getting there, to see that benefits that already exist might be absorbing some of the inflationary costs. So it's an interesting way to examine it.
Great, thanks, Michelle. Yeah, that's a great point. And it really gets to one of the key questions that we get a lot from employers. So. Okay, perfect. So it looks like we have a question that came in that says, do you provide support or consultation for actually implementing a living wage program, particularly how to integrate into salary structures, pay program design, etc.? Michelle, do you want to take that one?
Absolutely.
Kind of building right off of what you were just saying.
So yeah, that's exactly what we do. This is sort of our starting point, and we wanted to make sure that we were able to have EPI explain their own methodology, because they are really the basis of where our numbers come from. And we had an opportunity to talk through any questions that come with that. But as an organization, what we do is work with an employer first on doing a total remuneration assessment. So we have a tool that works through and compares what does that mean for your remuneration package. If we say on the open market with subsidies, a family health insurance plan at a silver level costs $600 a month, and yours costs $1,000 a month to supply, but you're only asking workers to contribute 10% of that, then you're saving workers $500 a month on accessing that insurance. So we're sort of running that analysis on all different types of benefits and really seeing how much are their cost savings to the worker that come out of those, and also looking at what are the tax savings to the worker that come from having that in-kind benefit where they don't have to have that as taxable income. So we first look at doing that analysis and coming out with a report that we share with employers. Once we are able to share that report, it will have recommendations as well to close the gap. So it might tell you to look at things like, hey, childcare is a very expensive cost of living across the US. Have you thought about providing childcare reimbursements? If you do so, because not all of your employees are likely to have kids at an age where they need childcare, you're covering that cost for every worker, and it might be at a much lower cost to you as the employer. So we work through trying to highlight those types of opportunities for employers to close living wage gaps in a way that is really cost effective, and talk about how those can be integrated. We're always happy to, if you want to reach out to us to integrate any of this for you, but then we also work with either our affiliate members or our certified employers to help them understand how to close gaps year over year or keep up with the new cost of living adjustments that EPI puts together, and we then do a little post-production on to get to our living wage rates. So yeah, it's sort of a full service, how do you actually deal with this data, look at everything.
Perfect, thanks so much, Michelle. Great, Zane or Elisa, anything you wanted to add on now as we're kind of getting towards the last few minutes here?
No, I just want to say I really appreciate all the work that you all are doing, post-production, and getting this out there. I mean, this is the purpose that we have created the calculators for. So I commend you and I commend all the businesses that are really stepping up and using this in the way that we've intended. So if you have questions afterwards, we are also happy to answer them after this webinar if other things come up.
Perfect, great, thanks so much. Okay, so just in closing then, if you are a living wage employer, or perhaps you're working on a living wage application or considering putting in a living wage application, you might have questions, and we've gotten a few questions about, okay, so what do I do with this information now that the living wage rates are out there? Well, the new data is available on our website. You can find the specific data for your location or locations in the map if you visit our website, there is currently a grace period that is in effect. So we provide 6 months for when new living wage data comes out for employers to implement that. So that means until June of this year is the grace period, and then after June 2023, any new applications that come in after that point will need to be approved based on the latest rates. Now, in the interim, you can still go ahead and do a living wage assessment. We'll still have the latest data available for you for that assessment because we want employers to be able to plan forward, for that time when the new rates become mandatory. Now, for certified employers, keep in mind that your annual renewal is due 12 months after your initial certification. So do start your update as early as possible. I know a lot of companies do their compensation updates early in the year. January or Q1 is quite common for that. So if that's your cycle, be sure that once the new living wage data is announced, and as we mentioned, we do those updates in November of every year. So that's part of the reason why we do that is so that the data is available for you at the beginning of the year when you're doing your compensation planning. So work on that as soon as possible. For tier 1 employers, the requirement there, if you're a tier 1 employer, you know that the requirement is to increase wages year over year over the entry level tier 1 rate, to move towards that, to close the gap towards that tier 2 living wage. And so for this year, use 6.5% as the annual inflation increase, plus 3% to close the gap. So it's 6.5 plus 3%. That's the number that you should use. Fortunately, we've taken care of that math for you. So if you have an assessment on our platform, you're a tier 1 employer, you can use our online assessment tool. Contact us if you have any questions about how to use that, but there is basically a year-over-year tracker that gives you those specific calculations. So you don't need to do the math yourself. Based on your initial application, you can always go into the system. The system will tell you, where are you relative to that inflation plus 3%. For tier 2 employers, it's a little bit simpler. Basically, you can just look at the tier 2 rates, just make sure that you're keeping up with those. Again, they're available on the website. And if you're an employer that maybe you have many locations across the US, we have employers that have, 60, 70, 80 commuting zones where you have operations. That's fine. You don't have to look them up one by one on our online assessment tool. You can get those off of the tool. If you've already submitted an application, your data is there. We can automatically update that for you, so it has the latest data. And most employers in our system have already had that updated. So yeah, before your renewal is due, we'll be in contact with you about a month before with a reminder to make sure that you update your application for your certification renewal. But you don't have to wait for a reminder. Feel free to jump on there at any time. Now is a great time to get in there and do your updates, especially if this is the time that you're doing your compensation and benefits changes for the year. So please contact us if you need any help with updating your data. And with that, I'll just see if there's any closing comments. Oh, thanks, Michelle. So a link to where we publish all the living wage rates is here. I'll put that out on the chat as well. Great.
Yeah, I just wanted to add in, just letting you know, this is going to be an annual thing for us, and it's a long-term partnership with EPI. They've been doing great work. So every year we'll come out with new rates, try to talk a little bit about the trends and explaining some of that. If you have any questions, and if anyone wants to follow up with us after with more details, feel free to reach out to Michelle at livingwageforus.org or Biko at livingwageforus.org, and we will be happy to point you in the right direction. As Elise and Zane said, if you want to connect with them as well, certainly welcome to do so. We just want to get this data used and available as much as possible. But thank you all for coming today and really listening in on what we are trying to do to make sure we have accurate living wage rates across the country.
Great, excellent. Thanks, Michelle. Thanks, Zane and Elise, and everyone for joining. Have a great rest of your day and look forward to being in touch with you soon.